Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar for today. We're going to get started in just a minute and let all the attendees join. All right, so I think we might have a few more dialing in, but just to go ahead and get us started today. So first, thank you guys for joining us. We really appreciate having you. Our webinar today is going to be the ESG Matrix, Understanding the Alphabet Soup of ESG Disclosures. My name is Michelle Winters, and I'm the VP of Solutions here at Gobi, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. So as we all know, ESG is an extensive industry with considerable number of reporting frameworks with terms and acronyms that could fill up a dictionary. With the almost overwhelming number of options available, it can be hard to know where to begin or how to plan your next steps. So during today's webinar, we're going to be reviewing different sustainability reporting frameworks such as GRESB, CDP, GRI, SASB, and more. We're going to give you some tools to identify which ones are right for you and your organization, as well as alignment or differences across these frameworks. We will also look to provide insight into identifying the best approaches for your organization, help you stay on top of emerging ESG trends, provide next steps for systematic creation and management of a scalable, more cohesive, and more effective ESG strategy. And with that, so our session will run about 50 minutes in length, and we will leave time at the end for questions. The webinar will also be recorded and sent to all participants. So before we begin, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our two speakers for today. First, so Griffin Charles is our ESG consultant here at Gobi. His experience has been focused on project implementation and sustainability reporting within both public and private sectors. His current areas of focus include series certifications, benchmarking compliance, and portfolio-wide ESG strategy. Kylie Ford, you may recognize from one of our other webinars. She's one of our senior ESG consultants with over a decade of ESG management consulting and program experience. She's an expert at bridging multiple roles and has worked with organizations of all sizes across all sectors. She's focused on employee engagement, strategic business development, and process improvements. The last thing I'll mention before we get started is please feel free to submit any questions throughout the webinar in the bottom right-hand corner. We're going to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. All right, with that being said, Griffin, the stage is yours.
All right, thanks so much, Michelle. And Kylie and I are really excited here to talk to you guys about some of these different ESG frameworks. So there's a couple objectives too that we would like to kind of accomplish during this webinar. So one of the first things, there's all these acronyms out here, these different types of frameworks. We kind of want to define some of the key frameworks that are being used, but also kind of classify them, give you different ways to kind of categorize them to see which ones might be the best for your use. We'd also want to connect them a little bit. So a lot of these frameworks have actually been designed to work in tandem and to be complementary to each other. So we're going to kind of give you some examples here of how they can work together and when it might be a good instance to use more than one. And also understanding what's right for your company. So you might have heard a lot of these acronyms, seen some peers using them, but what are some of the variables that your organization should kind of key in on and look for when determining what is going to work best for you guys? And discovering industry trends. So it's always kind of important to see what everybody else is doing and see what's kind of coming to the forefront. So here we're going to be looking at some of the different frameworks that are kind of coming, getting a little more attention, being used a little bit more, and seeing what else is kind of developing in the market as well. And then lastly, planning next steps. So you are interested in doing some kind of disclosure, some framework. How do you take that from this webinar and actually move forward and start that journey of actually disclosing, whether if you do it already or you're trying to add a new one or a first-time reporter, what can you do first to move forward? All right, so kind of the basis of this webinar, we've been receiving, some different kinds of questions. They typically boil down to two similar ones. So the first one is, where do I start with reporting and disclosing? There's all these acronyms out there. How do I make sense of which ones are right for my company? And where do I start to if I'm interested in actually pursuing one of these? The other one the other question here is, what and how do I disclose? So what would be important for my company to actually disclose and report? Is posting something on my website good enough, or should I actually use one of these frameworks to add a little more legitimacy some more relevance to my reporting and my framework. So if we take a step back and actually ask ourselves, why should we disclose in the first place? Which is always kind of important when we're looking at it. So if you're going to be dedicating all these resources to actually pursuing some of these frameworks, what are some of the reasons? So number one, it's a big one. It's attracting investors. So especially we've been seeing it in 2020. A lot of investors could be screening out companies that do not pursue some of these disclosures and these frameworks. So it can kind of separate some organizations from each other when investors are looking for the right place to put their money. So that's always been a big one. It's increasing this year as well. And if your organization does undertake one of these frameworks, it's kind of an involved process. So you're going to learn a lot about your company. There's going to be a lot of different interdepartmental cooperation. So you're going to kind of see some ways that your business works together and you gain some insight about your own organization. So that might uncover some ways that you guys can improve your efficiency and streamline some operations. It might also uncover some risks too. So if we're thinking about ESG, you're an organization that's considering ESG topics, you're inherently thinking long term. So you might uncover some things that might be risks down the road. If you're kind of diving into one of these frameworks and you might uncover that your business is not necessarily prepared when it comes to climate resiliency. So that's something that could come out when you are undertaking these mechanisms and these processes for disclosing. And the last reason too is complying with regulation. So it might come to the point where we have some different governmental bodies, other organizations that are requiring some of these disclosures too. So if you're getting to the forefront and you're starting now, you might be ahead of that. You might be more prepared too when it comes to reporting to any future regulations. And so those all sound great on paper. Those are all great reasons to kind of disclose, but kind of bottom line is if you're going to be spending money on this, if you're going to be investing resources as well as personnel and time, you kind of want some more proof, something to beef that up if you're trying to get some approval from leadership. So one of the really encouraging trends we've seen pretty much in the last 2 years is record inflows when it comes to sustainable funds. So ESG funds and ETFs have really exploded over the last 2 years. So we're kind of seeing some record investment in this sector too. And why are these companies investing in these sustainable funds? It's because we can see studies have shown there is that relationship between financial performance as well as ESG performance. So some studies recently have kind of shown that and kind of validate a lot of these ESG efforts for companies. So that's kind of really driving the record investment. And then we're also seeing it on the other end, the interest in pursuing those frameworks as well. So now we've kind of talked about why you might want to disclose from kind of a big picture. We kind of also want to break down how you can classify these to make sure you're picking one that actually meets your needs, meets your stakeholders' needs. So one of the ways we can look at them, you guys might have actually seen some of these graphics before, and we think it really drives home the point of how to break these apart is there's reporting frameworks. So these might be something, it's more of a questionnaire or a survey. You're putting in qualitative or quantitative data. You're typically getting back maybe a scorecard, a rating, some kind of score. You can use that to kind of benchmark yourself against your peer groups, or it might be just something to give you more insight on how your organization's doing in terms of ESG. So more putting in data, you're getting out a scorecard, getting out a rating. There's also though the guidance frameworks. So everyone might be more familiar with GRI. That's a pretty common one. It's been around for years. Some of these other guidance frameworks as well, they're going to more shape your ESG deliverable. So it could be a sustainability plan or sustainability report, but you're using these goals, science-based targets, could be SASB, GRI. They're really going to be shaping your deliverable, making sure that you provide the right context. You're reporting on the most material topics to your organization. But at the end of the day, it is still your report that you're kind of putting together as opposed to just getting a scorecard or a rating. And our last category here would be the third-party aggregated frameworks. So these are kind of be taking an independent look at how your organization is doing in terms of ESG performance. So that's where, participation of the reporting or the guidance frameworks might benefit your company when it comes to these third-party aggregated ones. All right, framework alignment. So the one thing to kind of look at too is that, I think it's kind of important to note is that sustainability reporting doesn't necessarily exist in a vacuum within your organization. So especially with some of these new frameworks, it can really bridge the gap between different types of reporting as well. So we kind of have sustainability reporting. Let's say you kind of pursue SASB. So if you're looking at SASB, you're reporting on those ESG topics that are financially material to your company. So you're bridging that gap between sustainable reporting as well as financial. And let's say on the other end too, if you're doing a GRI report, you might be doing some of that more business communications, that kind of marketing piece, but you are in the same sense reporting on disclosures for ESG that are material to your stakeholders. So by looking at a couple of these different frameworks, you can really tie together reporting for your company across a few different sectors here. All right. The other way too to kind of look at some of these frameworks is what we kind of call the data story continuum. So what you get out of some of these frameworks at the other end of all that work, all that effort you're putting in, it kind of differs. So we kind of talked about the guidance ones and the reporting ones. The reporting ones kind of match up too with the data end of this. So you're going to be getting something out that you might be reporting just hard data. You might be getting a score. But if you're looking at more of the reporting or the guidance frameworks, might be towards the story end. And another thing we kind of like to look at too is the audience. So this kind of matches up pretty well with who we're reporting, hopefully reporting to and want to see this data. So that's another thing that it's important to consider when you're looking at the frameworks you want to participate in. It might be investors, it might be the government. If we're talking about regulations, they might just be looking for the data. They might be just looking for one of those reporting frameworks. You're just sending in data, getting a score back. But we might be in the middle here too. If we're looking at customers, advocates, people that kind of understand the ESG language, they're digging a little bit deeper, but they also do want to know a little bit more about your ESG program in general to get more of a narrative and an understanding of what your company is working on and where your goals are at. But if we're looking at the far end here, just a story, that might just be a typical business piece or marketing piece talking about employees and customers. So when we're looking at these frameworks, though, it does a great job. A lot of them are kind of in the middle here. They take a little bit of the story, but also the data to give you kind of a robust, comprehensive ESG piece and good disclosure for whoever your preferred stakeholder is. So I know I've kind of given a general overview of some of these different frameworks, where you can categorize them. So I kind of left Kylie here with the heavy lifting and give you some specific examples. So Kylie, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Sure, thanks, Griffin. And really, continuing with the data story continuum for just a minute, I think you hit on a real key point too, which is that a lot of people tend to view ESG disclosures as a means to one very specific end. We want to attract more investors. We want to make sure we're considering long-term risks, whatever it might be. But what this also demonstrates is that it can serve multiple ends. Maybe you don't think that customers would want to read through your financial sustainability related disclosures. Honestly, they probably wouldn't, but by going through the exercise and uncovering how your sustainability issues impact your financial performance, that really, creates that story behind it. What is your company doing? How is this driving you? How is this orienting you within this market? So as Griffin said, we're going to drill down on a few specifics. And if we defined every single one of these disclosures and every acronym, I don't think we'd ever leave this webinar. So let's start with two for right now, TCFD and SASB. You may have been hearing a lot about them this year. We certainly have. TCFD comes from the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Basically what it is, TCFD released recommendations for specifically climate disclosures tied into your financial performance, whereas SASB is sustainability disclosures tied into financial performance. So that's why you see sort of that smaller circle of TCFD fitting entirely within SASB. TCFD and SASB are intentionally aligned, and there's actually guidance out of how you can satisfy full TCFD recommendations within a SASB disclosure. So, okay, that's your sustainability framework. That's where it sits, and it certainly overlaps climate, especially because TCFD recommendations only touch on climate. But the broader picture is that it's oriented in your sustainability actions as a whole, how your company impacts the environment and society, how you're moving and being a responsible business in this. And that's where that story really comes out of. And this is just two frameworks that you can use that have received a lot of focus. And yes, it's about your financial drivers, but it can uncover so much more. It's not just your financial performance, but really orienting you in that broader ESG picture. But while we're talking TCFD, the good news is that there may be a lot of frameworks, but they know there's a lot of frameworks. The people who write these frameworks are well aware that there are so many. So there's intentional alignment. And this is a chart. We don't need to break down every aspect of it, but it shows the ways in which SASB metrics and guidance are aligned with TCFD recommendations. CDSB requirements are also in on there. And you can see that there's a whole lot of common themes, and this is intentionally so. The idea is really never to make it top heavy for anyone who's participating in this disclosures. Really, the driver behind all of these options is that we have better information, that we're able to really mindfully enter into this marketplace and move forward in ESG together. So it's just putting structure behind what the disclosures are and allowing you to think through it in a very well thought out way, an industry accepted way as well too, so that there's standards behind it. So, moving on from here, one of the things that I think that's important to note is that there's no topics among these disclosures that are going to completely shock you. If you know vaguely what sustainability topics are, they're going to present themselves within these frameworks. And this is a SASB materiality map in particular, or the topics that are of material importance. And you can see how there's, given different sectors, there's going to be certain areas that are focused on that are a little bit more maybe drilled in for particular financial disclosures than others. So there's an adaptability to all these frameworks too. It's never all or nothing, but really what makes sense for your company to truly be disclosing. So let's talk about framework alignment with all the frameworks now. And as Griffin and I were talking through it and trying to lay it out, it became this really increasingly bizarre math problem in a way. And I'll get into why that is, but let's just take TCFD, just those climate-related financial disclosures, it's recommendations, in fact, and look at some other frameworks and how they fit into it. Well, there's CDP, that's the Carbon Disclosure Project. And if you remember back a few slides, that's one of those sort of online portals that you go into, you answer the questions, you have both a qualitative and a quantitative part of it. And because it's specifically climate related, participating in CDP almost fully meets all TCFD requirements for what it is you should be examining, especially with the earlier sections of the CDP where it talks about specifically climate risk and climate risk communication within your organization. But then if we look at something like GRI, as Griffin said, it's been around forever. It's the Global Reporting Initiative, and they release disclosures and standards of what they recommend you include in a standalone CSR report that your company has. It's a much broader subject scope because a company CSR report is a broad topic. It's in some ways a marketing piece as well too. So if you only follow those disclosures to the letter, not all TCFD recommendations will be fully covered by it, particularly within the resilience. It's a wider guidance. However, that's not to say you can't then go on and complete the work of a TCFD requirements within, the same document. These do work together. SASB, meanwhile, it's purposely well aligned and complementary. It's financial disclosures, and it's just TCFD hones in on the climate section. So organizations can fully meet TCFD standards, as we said. Then GRESB, that's the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmarking. Which it comes around once a year. It's an online questionnaire, very similar to CDP actually, where there's qualitative and quantitative. There is some alignment to TCFD recommendations, but far more heavily in the currently optional resilience module. So it's not to say that GRESB is unrelated to everything else that you're doing, but just being aware of the subject matter and how they intertwine. A good rule of thumb, and I don't know a better way of putting that, is there's sort of this triangle of CDP, GRI, and SASB. They are built together. The organizations have been aligned with one another. There's been a lot of communication and cooperation around these frameworks. So when you undertake one, it's very easy to begin looking into the others. Uh, on the other side, oops, there we go. We've got GRESB, where that's wider guidance, but like we said, it maybe gets you halfway through a SASB. It's not to say that there's no value in GRESB. Of course there is. You're benchmarking against real estate peers. That's incredibly valuable, especially because peer groups are defined by asset classes. But just being aware that there is going to be a little bit more work and a little bit more conversations that will need to happen internally to be able to satisfy all that which is SASB. We've got the Dow Jones Sustainability Index as well, and that's quite industry specific in some questions, probably more so than most of these other frameworks we have touched on. But with regards to climate change, it very intentionally aligns to CDP, which in turn aligns to the suggested disclosures of SASB, which in turn can be used to satisfy full TCFD. So hopefully you're starting to see why this was a weird math problem. It's like TCFD has 3 oranges and CDP has 4.5 of them, and I don't know how to compare against GRESB when it comes to this. But the point is there is intentional alignment no matter what. You're never going to be doing one and just completely off topic for all the other disclosures that you might be exploring within your organization. All right. Oh, and I'm sorry, I almost forgot UNPRI, one of my favorites. This is from the Principles of Responsible Investments, which is intentionally aligned to GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and that has the inclusion of sustainable development goals as well, too. This is actually becoming more and more commonplace that you'll hear people are UNPRI signatories. A real advantage of UNPRI, too, is that you can become a signatory and you have a full year before you need to begin reporting. So that arms your company with a solid goal, as well as a runway to be able to get there and to meet the requirements. So that might be something that's right for your organization, particularly if you've already gone through a GRI disclosure CSR report. Just to show you a little bit more of the overlap and maybe a more visually interesting manner than blocks of text, this shows a bit of the topics and really which disclosures have which components. And it's not to say that you go through GRESB and it's light on anything, but just in comparison with how deep some of these other disclosures get, GRI really, if you're satisfying all material disclosures within it, you're digging into environmental. So you'll see that there's very few where there's topics that just aren't represented. PRI is a little bit lighter on the carbon and climate change side, and that's why sometimes PRI respondents, they also make sure that they're participating in CDP just to have that more complete picture. But in general, there's a lot of topic overlap. Like I said, if you've seen one sustainability disclosure, you're not too far off from seeing pretty much any others. So that's all well and good, but you might be asking, okay, oh, I'm sorry. One more way of looking at the alignment between them is just kind of understanding who's reporting and when, because not all of these frameworks, not all of these questionnaires are due at the same time. They're also scored differently. As Griffin had mentioned earlier, some give you a scorecard, whereas some, the focus is just on transparency. So when it's things like disclosures that you integrate into a report, you're not getting a letter grade on it. You're just putting it out there, and that's what investors are looking for. It's that level of transparency. In terms of investor focus, really what this is about is the target audience. Generally, GRI aligned sustainability reports, that's more of marketing collateral piece that investors might like to know that you have, but they're specifically going to be more focused on things like TCFD recommendations being integrated and taking a look at those financial performances. Then you can also see that there's some that are a little bit more tailored to certain industries than others. CDP, for instance, has different question sets depending on what industry you're in, whereas something like GRI, it's intentionally supposed to be broad so that every company can participate. So most of those, really it's open to all participation depending on anyone who wants to be able to adopt these, but just keeping in mind the differences in reporting periods and the timeline of when they come out, and understanding that there's going to be some aspects of this one's scored but this one's not. That's another thing to keep in mind. So what's right for my company? We probably still haven't told you this at any point, but there's a few considerations that when you are thinking through these disclosures, how do you land on one? And we've had a lot of clients come to us saying, oh, we really want to participate in X. And once we talk to them, it's like, this is really not material to what you're looking at. So there's three factors that we like to look at. One is audience. Really, who do you want to be reading your disclosures, and what do you want your audience to understand about your ESG efforts? Remember, with the data story continuum, these disclosures can support that story and can actually provide teeth to what you're saying. Another important thing is, do you have competing audiences with different views or need to be informed in different ways? There's going to be some audiences that are not going to be as literate on ESG matters and very specific disclosures as others. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second is the driver. Why are you talking about ESG disclosure? Why are you here at this webinar? There has to be some reason. And likely it might be that you've been hearing about it from investors. But another thing is that it might be there's drivers pulling you in opposite directions. Maybe you have some people on your senior leadership team telling you they really, really want disclosures, while you've got someone in compliance saying, no, we don't want to put that out there. That's totally normal, but understanding what the forces are and which forces you're trying to meet, which risks you're trying to speak to, that's really paramount when you're picking the proper ESG disclosure for you. Finally, resources. These take time. Griffin and I can definitely attest to how much time these take. Do you have internal staff that can be dedicated to a particular disclosure, especially given the different timelines that we had laid out before you? If you want to do something like a GRI aligned CSR report, do you have time on your marketing department's calendar to even be producing this? And if so, when? I'm sure our marketing department would not want this to be, thrown on at the last minute. And then, are there any cases where you would need to bring in outside help? Do you need consultants? Do you need third-party data providers? Anyone who might be able to support this effort, because it is an undertaking, and sometimes there are areas where you're going to fall short. That's a crucial thing to understand, and maybe some of these disclosures have a little bit less of a barrier to entry in terms of the resources that need to be devoted to it than others. So, all right. This is very philosophical, perhaps more in depth, but let's try and give a solid example. Griffin, help me out. I build, own, and manage multifamily residential buildings. And I also know that I want the following things for my organization. I really want to be able to benchmark my performance against my peers. How am I doing? Am I doing okay? Am I really ahead of the game? I feel like I've invested in a lot of LED retrofits. I want to advertise sustainability initiatives as a way to attract tenants. More and more in the multifamily spaces, we want tenants who, they care about energy efficiency. They want to make sure that energy bills aren't going to hurt them. I want to actually accurately report on my GHG emissions. This is becoming a material concern for me. And finally, I want investors to be able to look at something like a scorecard and see what recommends me as a business that they would look to invest in. So Griffin, what do I do?
Sure. So I'd say there's a couple things we want to key in on here first too. We kind of talk about the audience as well. So we're talking about, we mentioned here tenants. We're also talking about investors too. So the first thing, especially when we're talking about benchmarking as well, this is a multifamily residential. They want to benchmark against their peers. So GRESB would be a great thing for that. So if we look at GRESB, there's a couple reasons why that might be a great solution for them. They own these different buildings. So, data collection can be really tough for GRESB. We can run into a lot of issues trying to pull all that together to get your scorecard prepared. So that's one reason it might be kind of easier for this company to do GRESB as well. But it's also going to contextualize their performance against their peers. So they're going to get that scorecard that they want, that they're looking for against their peers. They're going to know how well they're doing and maybe some areas they can improve. So at the same time, though, it might also give them something to show to investors, saying that this is how well we're doing, this is what we're doing, and these are some areas that we might want to improve on as well. So they're kind of hitting those two different points with just the one framework there. So second would be CDP. So we mentioned that greenhouse gas emissions were kind of key to their stakeholders. So maybe company A did a materiality assessment and they've identified some of their key stakeholders, and greenhouse gas emissions really came out as one of the top things that they're interested in, increased transparency. So CDP, while we are able to kind of get greenhouse gas emissions calculated through maybe some other sort of framework, CDP is going to give us a really comprehensive look at their total emissions to get a better idea of how well they're doing with their building, if it's energy related emissions, and it's really going to give them that whole picture and satisfy a lot of the questions that stakeholders may have when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, thank you. I think you set company A up for great success. No, but in all seriousness, this exercise is useful because I think a thing that's missing in a lot of people trying to pursue ESG disclosures in general is thinking through what those goals might be. And it's not a one-size-fits-all solution for anyone. Sometimes you can just use industry to help guide what you should be looking at. For instance, if you're a private equity company and you know that you want to be working more towards ESG goals, but your focus is maybe on due diligence of screening the companies you invest in, something like UNPRI, which is specifically about responsible investment, might be the best fit for you as well too. So there are some choices that can jump out that you just commit to, and then that really leads the way forward. Let's talk about industry trends more in a general sense, which is that there's a reason we hammered on TCFD and SASB. And that's because climate-related disclosures, climate resilience, this has become such a hot item right now, especially with how disrupted 2020 is. Things like business continuity plans have come to the forefront, making sure we're prepared for changes to come. Well, climate change promises a lot of disruption potentially, seeing what could happen, increased severe weather events, even sort of reassessing how risk works. So making sure that you're really thinking through what those long-term risks are, even if you know in the next 3 to 5 years probably not going to happen, that's really crucial. Another trend is measurable goal setting. So definitely in the early aughts and actually for the greater part of the 2010s, a lot of companies were able to say, oh, we are committed to reducing energy. We are committed to operating in more sustainable ways, but show us. Well, now the trend is, okay, we have a goal and it's measurable. We are committed to having more diverse applicant pool, and here are the numbers we have to show it year over year. We are committed to reducing our energy footprint by X% in the next 5 years, and really just measuring against that project. And certain disclosures, especially the CDP I'm thinking of, they have you track your goals year over year, and it can be an intensity goal. So as you grow, your goal can grow with you too. But what we're seeing is a lot more of these disclosures are integrating that. Finally, standalone reports. This is where Griffin and I will talk up GRI as a pretty good framework for any kind of CSR report. But that really is the case. More and more companies have these as collateral that whoever it is, customers, tenants, investors can look at and have a really concise story of what they're doing in the ESG realm. So those are really the top 3 trends. And we understand that there's a lot of complexities behind it. So if you're still lost on what to do, you're definitely not alone in that regard. And oops. And what we might recommend in that case is materiality. That's one slide too far. And really orienting yourself on what are the topics that are of most importance to you and your company. So with materiality, and Griffin, you can probably help speak to this process a bit as well. It's surveying different stakeholder groups and understanding their views, what they consider to be significant versus insignificant risks, and what impact it might have on your company. And for instance, GRI has a materiality component, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah, and kind of the good thing about GRI too in that sense is that why report on things that aren't necessarily important to you or your stakeholders. So by taking a look at what is actually material to everybody, you're really honing in on what the disclosures you should be focused on, and not wasting time with what may be relevant to a different industry, different sector, or different company. So you're really focusing on what's important to your own ESG performance.
Absolutely. And then if you're seeing things float to the top like climate change, that might tell you to look at CDP, for instance, or TCFD. So some of this can also just make it a little bit more obvious what direction you want to be moving in. We have been talking fast and a lot just because we're so excited about this subject matter. But let's open it up to everyone on the line now and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic, guys. Thank you so much. And now I think I want apples and oranges to be in the same room and let them put it all together. I want a nice fruit basket. That's what I'm hoping. If nothing else, we can kind of indicate some of these disclosures are trying to do to certain extents. So just as a reminder for everyone, really excited for some of the questions that have been coming in. If you have any additional questions based on what was presented on or that wasn't presented on that you want to ask these two great experts, please go ahead and add them into the bottom corner. I'm going to attempt to multitask and answer or ask as we go. So I'm going to first maybe talk about one of the questions I thought was great is throughout the presentation, it was mentioned stakeholders, right? And I think we all understand the value of stakeholders and what they can bring, because that's going to be a key aspect of defining what is material to your business. And that then in turn helps determine which frameworks might make the most sense. So Kylie, I'm going to throw the question to you first. Can you maybe walk through a little bit, how do you determine what stakeholders should be involved as part of this process? Maybe both internal and external, maybe some examples. And again, just how do you go about getting to that end resolution?
Sure. I mean, stakeholder groups can be as broad as you make it. The public is a stakeholder group. So certainly narrowing down which stakeholders you want to be valuing as a part of this process and considering about ESG disclosures is really paramount. A lot of companies would tell you just investors and that they don't want to look much further than that. Let's please the investors, but that's a very reactive way to be looking at ESG strategy. Certainly you want to know what attracts people to your business, but your senior leadership is also going to have their own understanding of what should be a focal point and how it marries into strategic goals. You might just not have insight into some of this. Also, there's your peer groups and what the industry is doing, the directions you're moving in. If you strongly want to be going in one direction without any consideration to what's happening around you in the market, then it could be a bold strategy, but generally gut checking is good. Finally, your employees, that's a key stakeholder group. There might be something that's viewed as incredibly important to your employees. Actually, the example matrix that we had just shown for what materiality might look like had women's empowerment viewed as significant to stakeholders, while perhaps maybe not so impactful to a company's success. That's true to an extent, but employee retention and attracting new talent, that's incredibly important. And that's where things like diversity and inclusion are becoming paramount as well too. So my own recommendation is to integrate the views of as many stakeholder groups within reason. There might be certain industry groups that have had certain stances and have their own focal points. Particularly right now, we're hearing a lot more about diversity and inclusion, about climate change disclosure, things like that, just from the industry in general. But then orienting yourself, it's sort of like which direction to steer the ship, using the stakeholder groups that are really going to affect your day-to-day, the drivers behind it. That's investors, that's senior leadership, that's maybe your employees as well, and then depending on business models, community groups. So I don't want to say it's all context dependent, because everything in ESG is context dependent, but certainly there's a few ways to start where you're not just having such a narrow window of whose perspectives you're asking. So I think at least a few external as well as internal groups set you up for the best success.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I would absolutely agree with all those components as well. And I think it of course varies. And so the couple of really great questions. I hope we've got a little bit of time, so I know we're going to get to most of these, but I thought this one was pretty great too, just given kind of the environment of 2020, and that this has been coming up even more and more frequently associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the specific questions was, our opinion on which framework might have the most measurable questions associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion, if we're trying to, potentially align with industry objectives. And thought this was kind of interesting too, because sometimes I get those questions on like, how do you measure diversity and inclusion? Do we want to, we want to measure, but how do you track performance, et cetera? But just, are there good frameworks out there that you would recommend, or you're kind of seeing within the industry that have kind of succeeded in this a little bit?
Yeah, I like GRI in general because it does invite you to be sort of disclosing what metrics you're able to track within this realm. And there are metrics where you can be quite successful. One thing to look at, a lot of times organizations, especially smaller organizations, don't necessarily want to look too closely at diversity and inclusion because it can seem a little almost like singling people out. That's really not what it's looking to do. It's just understanding systems. So some of the best metrics to look at are breakdowns of maybe compositions among gender or racial between just your employee base, and then people in management positions, people in leadership positions, and understanding the difference in percentages there. Another big one is attrition of maybe vulnerable employee groups that are working for you. Are you able to retain, or is there any kind of turnover that's happening? Especially with women in the workforce, some things that are done to mitigate attrition is to have more flexible maternity leave and phase back in programs, and that can prevent a lot of it too. So really, these metrics, they're not meant to say, oh, we're not doing well enough, let's not even look at this, or we don't want to talk about it. It's more to highlight, this is an area that we might want to consider to boost and to create a more sustainable, in the truest definition, able to sustain culture of our company moving forward. And then just to point out areas where, maybe there could be improvements made as well.
Okay. No, I think that was really good. And I know we've mentioned GRI a few times, and that's often what I find a really great alignment framework that, exactly as you said, kind of connects with multiple aspects of other frameworks as well. Griffin, so I know you've done quite a bit with GRI in the past. Can you maybe give an overview on what type of team members get involved when you're starting to look at GRI? How long does something like that typically take if you're implementing GRI? Is that always in a CSR report, or can you maybe dive into GRI a little bit more in detail?
Sure. So I guess I'll kind of start with the timeline too. For a first-time reporter, I think anywhere from 4 to 6 months from start to finish might be a pretty conservative timeline, because you do have a few different phases here. So as we kind of mentioned earlier, the GRI reports can already have kind of that materiality assessment built into it. In order to determine what topics you're even going to be disclosing on in this report, you have to go through that phase of seeing what's important to stakeholders, what's important to your internal stakeholders as well. So that can be kind of a process in itself too. That might take a month for you to kind of gather all that information and see what topics are out there. And you really kind of got to be honest with that process too, because once you get those topics, then you get into kind of the data collection for the actual disclosure. So that is typically a big hurdle too that I've seen is, if you're doing it for the first time, you might not even know who owns the data, depending on how your organization's set up. So it's kind of crucial to bring in the people that you think might have this data. It could be, if we are talking about different social metrics, it might be HR. There's most likely be some operations too, if we're looking at the different energy consumption or different disclosures like that. So it's tough to say maybe who to get involved, but once you do that assessment and see what the topics are, right away, you're probably going to want to try to reach out to everyone that you think might have that data to get them in the same room. And then there's always the, once you do have the content written out, there's also making it look pretty too. So it's kind of something we can't overlook. If you're working with graphic designer or you have it in-house, I always know that's kind of like the final hurdle is to, if we have to change up any content, make sure everything fits together, because we do want something that the organization's proud of to send out and really display what they're doing related to ESG and kind of how far they've come. So having a nice, visually appealing report always helps as well.
Yeah, and I've heard too that it's a nice also central location that can be shared with all of your stakeholders to be able to tell that kind of ESG journey and story and what it is that you're really kind of putting out there in terms of material topics to your organization. And it's actually a perfect segue to, I've got a few questions, maybe diving in a little bit more further into materiality, and maybe Kylie, I'll kick this over to you. Couple things associated with this, how would you suggest, the best way to identify these different issues? We talked about the stakeholder piece. When it comes to materiality, are we always looking at, especially if we have the lens of ESG in mind, is it always financial, non-financial? And then really, like, how do you kind of pull it all together? What does this materiality assessment, is one I hear frequently, of course, kind of focus on to come to these topics?
Right. Yeah. Honestly, not to talk up GRI more and more, but GRI has a disclosure on materiality that really does help talk through what material topics are. And I think there's always going to be a financial performance dimension to any material topic. We're talking about businesses. We want to make sure that we are sustaining in a financial future as well too. So of course that's going to be a paramount issue, but that's not all the topics. That when we're talking in an ESG context, we are talking ESG topics as well too. So things like stewardship, things like looking into your supply chain and seeing sourcing, things like diversity and inclusion that we're talking about. It can even be you know, data privacy. And where do you come up with these topics? GRI has a really good starting point of recommended material topic lists, and you can really narrow down based on, okay, this is less relevant, maybe animal welfare, we're not even in an industry where that makes any sense to be looking at, so we can strike it from the list, that kind of thing. You can also add topics just based on stakeholder groups or based on what you're hearing internally. If you know something like philanthropy is hugely important to senior leadership, add that on as a material topic. There's no limit to it. The concept of materiality is really just orienting you in what is important and who views it as important. And then that's what best helps set the way forward. So then how do you bring it together? There's a couple different ways, and generally what we recommend are in-depth interviews as well, where you're able to really talk and understand drivers and perspectives, in addition to maybe more of a quantitative tool. That's where the matrix will come into, where you're just having people rank sort of their knee-jerk reaction. How important is this to me? How impactful is this to my company? Assessing the risks on that way. So that's really how it's brought together. And I think it's a great way to really understand what your next steps need to be in the ESG space as well too. We talk about long-term risk all the time with ESG. That's why I'm such a fan of it, because I'm always thinking 50 years ahead anyway. Materiality assessments do that for you too, because there are topics. Climate change could be hugely impactful to a company and that will come out, but maybe that's not going to be impactful to you, in 2021. So that's the other element, is that it just allows these topics that we know are going to be important to have, almost the business case made for why there needs to be a focus behind it and why we should be supporting it with these disclosures.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good advice and really great things to be thinking about as you're going through what is material to my business and why. So something that is often material to every single business is money, costs, right? A lot of times it comes down to that. There's a couple of questions that are getting thrown out there, which I know is on everyone's mind, their ESG can be pretty, it's impactful, of course, but it can be, of course, I like how someone said weighty. I liked that, to the extent of there's a lot there. What would be some of your recommendations on, or rather two questions, what are some costs that you typically see potentially incurred? Like I know GRESB, for example, has a cost when you submit once a year. There's the cost of consultants to be or not to be in-house or out of house. What are some recommendations that you have across, maybe cross-functional teams, and costs to be aware of or think through that we typically see?
Yeah, there's a lot of costs. Some are a little bit more obvious. You pay $2,000 and you are a GRESB participant. Resource allocation is probably one of the more hidden costs that you think about, because if you need an employee working on a lot of this, their time is money. So even if they're dedicating 10 hours a week to that, that's a quarter of their week that they're going to be using for ESG disclosures. But honestly, another important cost to be keeping in mind is opportunity cost of not disclosing. So more and more, it's not just that graphic Griffin showed us where, okay, there is more investment in these sustainable funds, but it's that investors are using scrapers where they're just kind of analyzing what are you doing really fast without even looking at your website content itself. Just what do you have available? And if you're not floating to the top on that, if you haven't disclosed enough, you might be overlooked. So there is a real opportunity cost in missing out on potential investments, real opportunity cost on missing some of those risks that are going to come up. Like Griffin said, this is a changing regulatory environment. The EU is actually going to have required ESG disclosures for the first time starting next year, which PRI kind of criticized as being a little too light, but still, it's the first step. This is the environment we live in. So just arming yourself and being prepared for when this comes so that you're not blindsided, so that you already have these resources, that's truly where the cost, the break-even point, I guess, comes from. And that's what the business case is to be made with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point to make. I mean, yes, there's a little bit of upfront cost, but then you're also you look at it from a risk mitigation standpoint and looking down the road. And I think 2020 is an evident year for that. And for with everything that's really been going on. And I think that's another important aspect that I've seen is that 2020 has also indicated that each component has its own level of importance, right? So yes, we've talked about from a pandemic side, but also from a social unrest side. ESG encompasses quite a bit. Something that I heard that I also thought was really interesting, and as you're thinking about resources and who is involved with ESG, is when the pandemic hit, it was actually the ESG committees or an ESG key team member within organizations that were on the front lines for a lot of communication that was taking place. We typically see, within an ESG committee, you might have, or you should have, to an extent, legal, marketing, HR, operations. I know I'm missing a gazillion of them here, but those are, you needed impact from each of those roles when you're addressing how to navigate the pandemic. So I thought that was kind of an interesting aspect that I've heard across the board.
Yeah, it's really, it ties back in. Sustainability strategy leads to long-term resiliency. I mean, that's what sustainability means in essence. But things like, worker health and safety, that's been a chief topic for years and years now. And now we have policies formalized around it in ways that we didn't think about. Data security and privacy, now everyone is on Zoom and everything we're doing is digital. So yes, we need to make sure that there's protections in place. So, it helps you, it arms you for any bumps in the road that come along. And 2020 has been one bump after another, I think. But keeping that long-term risk mitigation focus in mind, the way that ESG forces you to, and keeping just how your company touches the planet and how your company touches people, that is what allows for long-term success.
No, absolutely. So I think we have time for maybe two more questions. One that was asked at the very beginning that I think is a good one to comment on is that, both the difference between the private sector and the public sector associated with the impacts of ESG, and for maybe organizations or companies that don't have as many outside investors, do you feel that this is still, a recognized value proposition? Are there other key components that maybe get called out? I think we kind of hit on that a little bit actually just now as I'm talking in the last question of health and safety, preparedness. Would you agree? Is there anything else specific that's worth commenting on to other stakeholders?
Talent attraction. Not to overstate what my generation tends to be looking for in a workplace, but more and more the workforce is passionate about companies that are doing right by society, and this is an increased value. So we talk about the unrest. Well, that has, its root in something material and in a morality that's going forward in the workforce. So that's something to think about is just attraction and retention in general. And then of course, everything else we've talked about with staying ahead of long-term risks. And then also screening, due diligence. If you are a private equity company, but you're investing in other companies, you want to make sure that this is a investment that will last long term, that has done their work for them and already thinking through the long-term risks. And you have so much power to help them think through those risks better too. So it's honestly a call to arms, I think, across the sector, and there's so much opportunity to really be perceived as a thought leader. So to me, there's a huge advantage to that. But certainly just in terms of the cost benefit analysis, orienting yourself and making sure you know what risks are coming, that's paramount. And then being able to continue attracting talent.
Absolutely. I also wanted to mention, maybe before we go into a last question here, there was a couple questions on will we be sending out the slides, and yes, we will. We're going to send out the slides. We're going to send out a copy of the webinar, so you're welcome to share it with anyone that couldn't join today. And then, of course, if there's any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. So wanted to make sure I mentioned that. And then maybe with our last couple of minutes here, and I know 2020 is the year, and we've mentioned COVID a few times, and I almost hate going into too much more of it, but I do thought this was good in terms of the direction that we see ESG going. And I think we're seeing some of those trends. And I think COVID has had a huge impact. And we talked about materiality assessments, and this is why we also recommend reevaluating the material topics every 3 to 5 years, because things can change in society that's going to have an impact on what's material to you now versus a couple of years ago. What are you seeing in some of the, and this kind of goes to both of you, of course, in terms of the industry trends? I know you talked about it, but are you seeing a higher increase in specifically the governance and the social components compared to the environmental? Can you just kind of comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, Griffin, I think you were just talking about this the other day.
So yeah, I think that's definitely kind of coming to the forefront. You know, obviously 2020, a lot of these issues within maybe the social component have come to the forefront. So we kind of would see a lot of measurable goals, as we'd say, with environment, with that portion of ESG. But now that people are talking about S&G, that's great if we can kind of set some aspirational goals, but kind of figuring out ways to also measure that progress too. So those are going to kind of be the priorities moving forward. You know, a lot of companies that are already involved in ESG kind of may have the E part down already. So S&G, I could see definitely being the focus for the next year. Also, obviously, long term too, moving forward.
Yeah, and metrics are beginning to come out. Like no one exactly knows what the best metrics are to look at, right? So diversity has kind of come as okay, we can easily look and see what the age distribution of our organization is, and those are really important metrics to be tracking. But other ones to look at, you know, they're sort of making sure you have 100% of suppliers signed on to your code of conduct and ethics. That's one governance metric that maybe you know, what percentage do you evaluate of your assets for climate-related risk on an annual basis, that kind of thing. So more and more we are seeing some of these S&G metrics coming to the forefront. It's sort of jockeying to figure out which ones are going to remain and which ones are going to be meaningful. But at the moment, it's a lot of baseline collecting for these metrics too. So I see S&G as the way forward as well too, orienting yourself as really doing well in society and attracting people for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's actually a great kind of ending thought as well, because I think these performance metrics are constantly changing and evolving. And I think that goes back to what's material to you and what you're looking at, and also trying to set those industry specific standards. That's where these frameworks can come in to help do that and provide a third party evaluation across the board. So it's all tying back together. But with that being said, we've basically come to the end here. Just to reiterate again, we'll be sending out the webinar recording. We'll send out the slides and the links. Our contact information is here below in the last slide. Please, please, please feel free to reach out to us, ask us any questions. If we didn't get to your question, we will try to maybe reach out to you directly. So thank you for joining us and for being here today. And with that, everyone stay well, and looking forward to the next webinar. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.